Weight loss drugs, they are absolutely everywhere, aren't they? But so are the stories about their side effects. Our goal today is pretty simple. We're going to cut through all that noise, look directly at the scientific evidence, and figure out what's real, what's rare, and what's still a bit of a mystery. You know, it feels like everyone has an opinion on these drugs, from the big news headlines to that post you just scrolled past on social media. But what do the actual large-scale studies, the proper scientific reviews, really say? That's the question we're diving into today. So here's how we're going to tackle this. Think of it like we're climbing an evidence ladder. We'll start on the very firmest ground with the most common side effects. Then we'll step up to the rarer, more serious risks. From there, we'll navigate the tricky territory of brain effects, learn how to put all this risk into perspective, and finally, wrap it all up with a clear summary of what the science truly shows. Right first rung of the ladder, we are starting with what's called Level A evidence. Now, this is the highest quality data you can get, coming straight from massive, randomized, controlled trials. This is the stuff we know with the most certainty. Well, the data here is just overwhelmingly clear. The most common side effects are all about your gut. I mean, just look at this chart. It's not even a close contest. For every one person on a placebo who felt a bit nauseous, nearly 3 people taking the actual drug felt the same. This isn't some subtle thing. It's a very frequent, direct result of the medication for a whole lot of users. And you know, while these issues are often described as mild and tend to pop up when the dose is increased, they can be pretty significant. In fact, they are the #1 reason people just stop taking the medication. Think about that for a second. In the major clinical trials, about 1 in every 25 people found these gut problems disruptive enough to quit the study altogether. Okay, moving up the ladder now, we get to risks that are scientifically confirmed but thankfully happen much less often. And this is where understanding the difference between something being possible versus probable really, really matters. 2 areas that are consistently flagged are the gallbladder and the pancreas. Now, the evidence for gallstones is solid. You can see the risk is about 3 times higher on the drug. But for pancreatitis, have a closer look. While it's a recognized risk, in this specific tirzepatide trial, the rate was identical to the placebo group. What does that tell us? It tells us that while the risk does exist, it is an extremely rare event. And now for the most debated and frankly the most confusing area of all when it comes to side effects, the brain. There are so many headlines and personal stories floating around, so let's try to separate the strong scientific evidence from the much weaker signals. First, let's just be really clear on our terms. When scientists talk about apathy, they don't just mean you feel a bit unmotivated or tired. It's a specific clinical term for a loss of motivation that isn't because you're sad or having trouble thinking. It's really about a change in your goal-directed behavior. And that's different from emotional blunting. This is when someone has a reduced response to feelings, both the good ones and the bad ones. People might describe it as feeling numb or sort of detached. It's really important to keep these ideas separate as we look at the evidence. Right, let's tackle the biggest fear head-on, suicidality. After a massive review covering over 100,000 participants, the FDA's conclusion was crystal clear. The data did not show increased risk for suicidal thoughts or actions. That is a direct, evidence-based statement from a major global regulator. And this conclusion is backed up by other high-quality research, too. Large-scale reviews find that these events are incredibly rare, and crucially, their rate isn't statistically any different from what you see in people taking a sugar pill. So on this specific, very serious concern, the best data we have is broadly reassuring. Okay, so if the evidence on suicidality is pretty firm, what about all these other reports? The anecdotal claims of depression, apathy, or that feeling of being emotionally flattened? Well, this is where the evidence gets a whole lot murkier. To really understand why, we need to get our heads around the difference between a signal and proof. A signal, like an individual case report, is interesting. It might suggest something is plausible, but it can't tell us if the drug caused the event or how often it might happen. Proof, well, that comes from huge, controlled studies that can properly compare outcomes and actually establish or refute a causal link. This distinction is absolutely vital. And that brings us to the bottom line on this topic. Right now, the claims about apathy or emotional blunting are based almost entirely on individual stories, what we'd call signals. We just do not have the proof from large trials that were actually designed to measure these specific outcomes. It's an area that definitely needs more research, but that high-level evidence just isn't there yet. This is the perfect time to talk about putting all this risk into perspective. It's honestly one of the hardest things for our brains to do, but it is so essential. We're going to use a real-world example of an emerging signal to see exactly how it works. So recently, some studies have flagged a potential link between semaglutide and a very rare form of vision loss called NAION. Now, that sounds incredibly scary, so let's break down the numbers properly. First things first, how common is this condition to begin with? The answer is, it's extremely rare. In the general population, only about 2 to 10 people out of every 100,000 develop it each year. That's our starting point, our baseline. Now, a large study suggested that semaglutide might increase this risk, but by how much? The absolute risk increase over 2 years was just 0.16%. So even if the relative risk doubles, the change in your actual real-world risk is tiny because the starting risk was already so incredibly low. That's the crucial difference between relative and absolute risk in action. Okay, let's bring all of this together. We have climbed the evidence ladder from the most common effects all the way to the rarest signals. Now we can stand back and look at the complete picture. This summary table really lays it all out, doesn't it? You can see the GI effects like nausea right there at the top, high rates and level A evidence right across the board. Then you move down to gallbladder disease and pancreatitis, also with level A evidence. But look how much lower those percentages are. Down at the bottom, suicidality shows no increased risk based on the best AB level evidence we have. And finally, for apathy and blunting, the evidence column tells the whole story. D/E. That means case reports and hypotheses only. This gives us a really clear evidence-based hierarchy of risk. So, after all of this, after reviewing all the evidence, we are left with this one fundamental question. It's not about whether these drugs have side effects, they clearly do. The real question is, how do we, as individuals and as a society, balance these documented risks against the proven benefits for treating obesity and the many serious diseases that it can cause? That's the critical conversation the evidence really invites us to have. Do you want to lose weight? Would you like to avoid the potential side effects of weight loss drugs altogether? Would you like to explore a safer option? Then the virtual Skinny Jab hypnotic weight loss program might be just what you've been looking for. Would you like to hear more? Visit the link for more info.